it's only going to be a part of the first chapter because you don't have an hour and a half here.
The first chapter
The
of what?
I actually, with the help of an editor, put it into book form.
Oh, really?
I've been telling this story for 12 years now, and it grows with each telling. And I hired an editor and an artist, and we've put it into book form now. And so this, it's the title, if you can't read that, is How I Came to Dowagiac, because Dowagiac, Michigan was the first town that the orphan trains left New York City to be taken to.
Dowagiac,
Michigan, yes. It's in the southwestern corner of Michigan.
Wow.
And the gentleman, Reverend Charles Loring Brace, was a minister in New York City, and he wasn't having much luck in his ministry, but he saw the need to get the children out of the atmosphere. He had an orphanage called the Children's Aid Society. It wasn't really an orphanage when he started it, but it has since become one. And his plan was to get them out of there. They didn't have parents, or if they did, the parents weren't part of the children's lives, and get them into a different atmosphere. And also, people out west were looking for help. Farmers needed help in their fields, women needed help with their children. And so this was his way to solve these problems. Of course, all the stories do not have happy endings. But he started this movement. And farming out, as it was called, that's old, that's ancient. That goes back to ancient Egypt, where the people would give children to other people. The Celts did it, gave their children, the rich royalty in the Celts gave their children to someone else to bring up, but they didn't lose possession of them as they did in this situation. So it's an ancient practice, but Mr. Reverend Brace put a new hitch on it. He put them on trains, and he also sent agents to the cities, to the towns where these children would be going, and people would sign contracts to take these children until they were 21, and then they made certain promises what they would do when they let the children go. And then he would send agents every year to check on all of the charges. Over 2,000 children were sent out of New York alone in that mode. Other orphanages picked up the practice after Brace, and he was in the 1850s. And as I said, it continued in 1929.
Wow. So
this was a long, long time where children were relocated.
Wow.
Not all of them were orphans, but so there were some bad stories, some bad things. But in my book, I concentrate on the first event, and I try to look on the positive side of it, because I'm looking to young readers.
Why don't you tell us the first chapter?
The first part of the first chapter, okay. I'll be very happy to. The book is told in the first person, and so if you will imagine going back to the 1800s, where all of the modern conveniences we have today are not there, communication is not there, and life is slower and a lot more simple, and in some cases not quite as nice as we have it today. My name is Elsie Dowdle, and in 1854 I came to Dowagiac, Michigan to find a new family. Before that, I lived in New York City with my parents, my father and my mother. We lived in a nice building, an apartment. I had my own bedroom. I had 3 meals a day. I had a bed to sleep in. I thought everybody had those things. I had a lot to learn that year I was 10 years old. We lived in a 3-story building. My father was in charge of it. He was the custodian. He made sure that the windows were clean and the steps were swept. He shoveled the snow in the winter. He made repairs. So he was around all day long. At night, he wrote stories for magazines and newspapers. He sold them. My father was the most honest person I knew. He never told the owner of the building that he did something that he hadn't done. And when he counted his words to sell his stories, he counted them 2 and 3 times so that he would not charge more than he was producing. My mother, she kept pigeons up on the roof. And she fed those pigeons and she raised them, and then she would sell them to butchers or to restaurants. And they would buy them, and that increased our income. I didn't know much about that then, but I knew that I had a pretty good life. Mom would use those pigeons for us on the holidays. We'd have roast squab. That's really cooked chicken, or cooked pigeon, I mean. She served them with turnips and baked potatoes. She taught me how to sew and to cook and to read music. I had a good life. But there's one thing my parents did not know about me, and that is, whenever I would leave the house, my mother would give me an apple or a piece of cheese or a hunk of bread to take with me to nibble on. I gave those things away a lot of the time. You see, when I got to the street, I would meet this girl. She was about my age, a little shorter than myself. We both had blonde hair. My mother said the color of my hair was a dirty blonde. Hers was really dirty. Her clothes weren't as nice as mine. They weren't as clean as mine. I knew she was a beggar, but I didn't really know what that meant. I thought she just begged and then went home at night. She called me Missy. She'd say, "Thank you, Missy," when I'd give her what I had in my pocket, and then I wouldn't see her for a few days. Well, this one particular day, I left the house with something in my pocket that I gave to Meg, and I went about my business. New York City. You're always smelling smoke in New York City. Everything's made of wood. Well, not everything, but most of the things. And people use wood to cook their meals or to keep their houses warm. There were fires, lots of fires. And it was exciting when the wagons would come down the street being pulled by the firemen. Dogs would chase them, children would chase them, and people would be yelling and screaming, and oh, it was very exciting. But you know, I was 10 by then, and if the wagon didn't come right down my street, I wasn't really that interested in chasing it anymore. So this day, when I heard the wagons, they were about a block off. I didn't chase them. When I got home to my neighborhood, the smell of smoke was heavy in the air. When I got to my street, my house was gone. How do you leave a 3-story building in the morning and come home later to ashes and rubble? I looked around trying to find my parents. There were people on the street. Some of them had blankets on, and some of them were holding each other, and I just couldn't find my parents. So I thought I'd look for a constable or maybe a fireman. And I looked around, and there was a group of firemen standing there, so I went over to them. But it was odd, because it was like the firemen were hiding one of their own. And I realized he was crying. A grown man was crying. Never in my life seen or heard of a grown man crying. And the other firemen were hiding him like they were ashamed of him. But I could hear him say, I couldn't get to them. I just couldn't get to them. And deep down inside me, I knew he was talking about my parents. I sat down on the curb, and I felt water on my hand, and I looked down, and I was crying, just like that fireman. And I was watching the people go by and hoping, and then there was a hand on my shoulder, and a little voice said, "Come on, Missy, crying never did nobody no good nohow." And Meg was right there beside me. She lifted me by the arm, and she took my hand, and she led me away. I just followed her. I did look back once, but she yanked me and said, "Come on, let's go." I didn't know where we were going, and to tell you the truth, I didn't really care. Someone else was in charge, and I was willing to follow her. She took me to places that I'd never been, and then she turned down an alleyway. Now, there's one thing you ought to know about me. When I get scared or nervous, I get the hiccups. Not like you get the hiccups, but they start down deep in my belly and they come up my throat, and I just can't stop hiccuping. Well, there were 3 boys in that alley. just standing there with their arms crossed, blocking our way. And I saw them, and I stopped, and I pulled my hand away from Meg, and the hiccups started. And Meg turned around and looked at me like, what's the matter with you? And I couldn't talk with those hiccups. I just pointed to those boys. And Meg turned around and she looked at them and she went, she walked down to one of them and slapped him on the arm and said, get out of the way. This is my friend and you leave her alone. I was so startled, I guess I stopped breathing funny and my hiccup stopped. You know, when you first meet somebody, you think one thing about them, but after you get to know them, you think another thing. I used to think that Meg was timid and shy and bashful and quiet. I had just found out she was in charge. She was a strong person. And she was going to be my salvation now that I was starting to live on the streets of New York City.